Welcome to The Flow, hosted by Bob Martin, slightly edgy glimpses into politics, culture, society, and being human.
Hey, welcome back to The Flow. I'm Bob Martin. And if you're just joining us, The Flow is someplace where we can slow down long enough to think about what's happening in politics, culture, and in our lives as citizens. Not to score points or to stay outraged, but just to understand. Because, in order to go with the flow, you first have to understand the flow. So last week in part one, we built the indictment. We traced how Fox News was constructed as a political instrument, how the Dominion lawsuit exposed what the hosts knew and what they broadcast anyway, and how the collapse of local news left a vacuum that the whole right-wing ecosystem just rushed in to fill. This week is a bit of a harder conversation. We're going to name media on the left honestly. We're going to explain why the equivalence argument doesn't hold and why that matters. And I'm going to tell you what I actually witnessed inside of real newsrooms over the course of a career. And then I'm going to offer you something practical, a little tool from the courtroom and the classroom that I think makes any of us a harder person to manipulate. So this is part two. But before we get into it, here's a question that I'd love to hear from you. The next time you read a news story or watch a segment, ask yourself, what issue is this piece actually examining and who defined it that way? Could it have been framed differently? And what would a different framing reveal? Just try it out this week and, drop what you find in the comments. I read every one of them. I mean that. And just one more thing before we dive in. The flow is my way of giving back. After production expenses, every dollar from paid subscriptions goes directly to Doctors Without Borders, World Central Kitchen, and Feeding America. When you subscribe, you're not just joining a conversation. You're helping feed someone, heal someone, keep someone from going to bed hungry tonight. So the link's in the description. Hope you'll consider it. All right, so let's finish this. Last week, again, we built the indictment. This week, we owe you a harder conversation. Because if you walked away from part one thinking that the answer was simply to watch CNN instead of Fox, we need to talk. And if you walked away thinking that anyone who watches Fox is beyond reach, well, we need to talk about that too. That's not where we want to go. So let's start out with the honest concession because it matters. Biased media exists on the left. Let's name it. MSNBC, or MS Now, is the most obvious example, and it's heavily biased in its selection and framing. There's the Young Turks, Pod Save America, Democracy Now!, Mother Jones, The Nation. These outlets exist. They have points of views, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of issue manipulation that I want to talk about. The question isn't whether left-leaning media exists. It does. The question is whether the ecosystems are equivalent. And here's where we have to be precise, because the answer is no. And the reasons matter more than the conclusion. First, the scale is not equivalent. The right-wing ecosystem is larger, more financially resourced, and more deliberately coordinated than anything on the left. MSNBC does not tell its viewers that all other sources are enemies of the truth, and the Dominion test is the clearest measure we have. That lawsuit revealed hosts who privately knew what they were broadcasting were false and broadcast it anyway. There is no equivalent moment like that on the left. No discovery that showed MSNBC anchors texting each other their private disbelief while amplifying a lie on the air. Now, bias in selection and framing is a real problem, and disinformation is a different category of problem entirely. Look, I've been lucky in ways that directly relate to this conversation. I have friends who are working journalists, and I've sat in morning budget meetings at the Miami Herald, one of the great American newspapers, and watched how the work actually gets done. I've listened to passionate arguments about whether a story is ready to be published or even if it should be covered at all. I've been on the faculty at Elon University, where we have a serious journalism program, and I know the faculty, and I know what they teach, and I know how they think about their obligation to the public. I was a columnist at the Burlington Times News. We had editors, a chain of command, people whose job it was to push back when I got something wrong. So here's what I witnessed across all of those experiences. Bias in mainstream journalism is real. It shows up most clearly in the selection and the placement of what gets the front page, what goes above the fold, what gets assigned to the third page. Honest journalists acknowledge this. It's part of the game. But once a story is assigned and reported, it goes through a curation process with real professional standards attached. Editors, fact checkers, correction policies, people whose job it is to catch errors before publication. The mechanism for accountability exists even when it works imperfectly. But that's not what we saw in the Dominion discovery. That's not what I watched on my television when Sandra Smith for Fox News described the Great American Fair with a lot of energy on a mostly empty National Mall. Now, the difference between imperfect journalism and a closed knowledge loop is not a difference of degree. It's a difference in kind. So let me offer you something that you might actually be able to use. In teaching critical thinking to my law students, I always start in the same place. Define the issue, because if you can control how an issue is defined, you can control the argument. That principle, which I learned in the courtroom and I teach in the classroom, is one of the most powerful tools we have for navigating a media landscape designed to confuse us. Here's what I mean. Defining the issue to fit the conclusion is not journalism, that's propaganda. A real journalistic question follows the evidence wherever it leads. A propagandistic question is engineered to reach a predetermined conclusion. It looks like inquiry, but the answer was already written before the question was asked. Another thing is pivoting the issue. Well, that's a signal that the original issue couldn't hold water. You see it all the time on television. There's a question that the host asks, and it doesn't get an answer. It gets an answer to a different question. That's a pivot, and it's telling you something. It's telling you that the original question had an answer that the answerer could not afford to give, did not want to give. So don't let them pivot on you. Another thing is that every issue ought to be a simple question. When questions and issues get complicated, there's just room for diversion. And they shouldn't be ambiguous either. You know, Senator Lindsey just passed away this week, and we might ask the question, was he a good senator? You know, it sounds like it's one question, but it's really multiple questions. Do you mean, was he good? Was he effective? Was he efficient? Was he morally consistent? Does good mean that he was faithful to his stated principles? So, depending on how the answer wants to construe the word good, depends on what they get to say in the reporting. So, we have to be, awake and aware. So, here's like an example. Here are two ways of asking a question, same policy, same idea, but just simply two different phrases for the same question. The first, what effect has considering race as a factor in college admissions had on the racial makeup of the college population? Now, here's the same question phrased a different way. How much has considering race in college admissions reduced opportunities for white applicants? Now, they look like they're about the same subject, but they're not the same question. The first follows the evidence wherever it leads. The second has already decided that an injury occurred and is only asking how large it is. Same policy, same facts, completely different terrain. In the courtroom, we talk about this as direct examination, a who, what, where, how question that is open for the witness to say whatever it is they feel is an appropriate answer to the question. But then on cross examination, we use leading questions, questions that sound like, you were at that bar on Saturday night, weren't you? So being awake and aware to the form of the question and whether it's a direct question or a leading question gives you a good clue as to the bias of the reporter. Now, a reader who can see that distinction is fundamentally harder person to manipulate. And that is why this is important. So here's where we land. First, there's a famous Zen saying. It says, when tired, sleep. When hungry, eat. In other words, when you do something, do it. And I suggest the same goes for the news. When consuming the news, pay attention to it. You know, if we sit back and just let it flow in and all that information goes into our database and it starts to subtly program us, but if we allow it in while awake and attentive, we can control how it programs our database. In other words, we get to have a say in what we accept and reject. And second, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. News is not the enemy. Real journalism is one of the essential mechanisms by which a self-governing people hold power accountable. Without local news, Burlington lost its eyes and ears on the commissioners and the school board. Without it, we don't know what happened in the Dominion lawsuit. Without it, the $787 billion confession stays a private conversation between lawyers. The problem is not the news. The problem is learning to tell the difference between journalism that is trying imperfectly to find the truth and a closed system that has decided what the truth is and is working backward. There is a difference between what you don't know and what you don't know you don't know. 2 weeks ago, a lot of us were in the second category, swimming in a system we hadn't fully examined. Now, hopefully, we've taken a good deep look at it, and that changes what's possible. We have more choices than we think. Most of us just haven't been given the tools to exercise them. So now, hopefully, you have a few more. I'll see you Monday for The Flow, Calm Waters, and next Wednesday for The Flow Weekly. Stay awake, stay aware, and stay engaged. I'm Bob Martin, and this is The Flow.